Shalom Havreim, James Trim here, and today I want to talk to you about the Sept, well, the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament and the Septuagint. You know, oftentimes when I talk to people about the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament, um, the knee-jerk reaction I get from people is that think they have some measure of scholarship with which to respond, is to say, "Oh, no, that's not possible because the New Testament quotes the Septuagint uh, frequently, and so this is supposed to be proof that the New Testament had to have originally been written in Greek." Now, there's several problems with this, and we're going to discuss those today. Before we get going, I need to ask people to please donate to support this work. We need your donations, especially today. By the end of the day tomorrow, at the time that I am making this video, we are going to need eight to have raised $850 that we don't have to cover bills that are hitting our account tomorrow night. That's Wednesday night. $850 that we do not have. So if you can donate, please donate today. And you can do that by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org or by clicking on the donate link in the video description. So please donate. We really need your help. These videos are brought to you by you. I can't do it without you. All right. Also, if you want to follow along, we have a PDF file that you can download and print. The link is in the comments, and that way you can follow along some of the quotations that we have. This is something that we commonly do with the videos. And please like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notifications bell so you'll find out when new videos are coming out. Let us know what you think of our videos in the comments section and participate in the comments, in the discussions in the comments. And all these things are things that the YouTube algorithm looks at to decide which videos to recommend to new viewers. And we like to be recommended to new viewers. So please like and subscribe and comment. Also, share these videos with your friends in social media, in Facebook and Twitter, etc. Okay, we're going to, as I said, when I talk about Hebrew and Aramaic origins of the New Testament, I often get a reaction where people will respond and say, well, the New Testament couldn't have been written in Greek. I mean, I'm sorry, couldn't have been written in Hebrew and Aramaic. It had to have been written in Greek because um, it quotes from the Greek Septuagint. And that just settles it. Well, there's a lot of problems with that argument. The first one, let's look at our first page of our handouts. The title is of the first page is Jerome on the original Hebrew Matthew, and the fourth century church father Jerome, who is known among other things for having been the editor and translator of the Latin Vulgate. Um, he writes in his Of Illustrious Men, section 3, he says, Matthew, who is also Levi and from a tax collector, came to be an emissary, first of all evangelists, composed a gospel of Messiah in Judea in the Hebrew language and letters, for the benefit of those of the circumcision who had believed, who translated into Greek is not sufficiently ascertained. Boy, that's a walloping important statement right there. the fourth century church father and translator of the Latin Vulgate's admitting that the book of Matthew was written in Hebrew, and then they don't even know who translated it into Greek. But he goes on, he continues and says, furthermore, the Hebrew itself is preserved to this day in the library at Caesarea, which the martyr Pamphilus so diligently collected. I also was allowed by the Nazarenes, who used this volume in the Syrian city of Berea, to copy it, in which is to be remarked that wherever the evangelist makes use of the testimonies of the Old Scripture, he does not follow the authority of the 70 translators, i.e., the Septuagint, but that of the Hebrew. To these belong the two, out of Egypt I've called my son, and for he shall be called a Nazarene. Uh, of illustrious men, 3. Now, there's debate as to what Jerome meant when he referred to, for he shall be called a Nazarene, but out of Egypt I've called my son is uh, a quote from the book of Hosea in Matthew chapter 2. And what Jerome is saying is that the original Hebrew Matthew, which was known to him, was used by the original Jewish followers of Yeshua called the Nazarenes, that that they had this Hebrew Matthew, and he was actually able to make a copy, hand copy, a copy from them when he visited them. And when he visited them, he made this hand copy. And one of the things that he discovered in examining this Hebrew text of Matthew is that, unlike the text of Matthew in the Greek and in the Latin that he created, in the Greek that he was familiar with, wherever there were quotations from the so-called Old Testament, or the Old Scriptures he calls it, it didn't follow the Septuagint. It followed the Hebrew text of the books of the Old Scriptures. Um, so, what Jerome is telling us is that the original Hebrew, uh, he's admitting that the book of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. We don't even know who translated it into Greek. And that in the original Hebrew, it didn't follow the Septuagint, it followed the Hebrew text of the Tanakh. Okay, so that's a very interesting comment and a strike for those that are arguing that the quotations from the Septuagint in the Greek New Testament prove it was originally written in Greek. So we actually do have a tendency here, and Jerome alluded to it in terms of the original Hebrew that he saw in the fourth century. What we find is that while there are places that the Greek New Testament seems to quote from the Septuagint, and you'll understand why I said seems to quote from the Septuagint as we continue this study on along. But not only that, but the Hebrew Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew and the Shem Tov Hebrew version of Matthew, but I'm particularly going to deal with the Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew that has come down to us, and we'll do a whole video on the Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew at some point. But the Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew, where it quotes the Tanakh, has just as much a tendency to quote from the Masoretic text, well, not the Masoretic text, but a text that agrees with the Masoretic text against the Septuagint. Um, and the Old Syriac and Peshitta Syriac Aramaic versions of the New Testament have a tendency to agree with the Peshitta version of the Tanakh. There's a Peshitta Old Testament as well as a Peshitta is an Aramaic version. So the Peshitta is has an Old Testament and a New Testament portion, and the Old Syriac and Peshitta versions of the New Testament books, whenever they quote the Old Testament, have a very strong tendency to have agreements with the Peshitta Old Testament. Okay, and I'm using these terms, Old Testament, New Testament, because these are the terms that are frequently and commonly used. Uh, the preferable term for is the Tanakh, or not Old Testament, and Ketuvim, Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes, not the New Testament. But uh, the point here that I'm making is that whereas the Greek New Testament has a tendency to quote from to follow the Septuagint in its quotes, I say tendency, it's not absolute by any means. There are times when the Greek New Testament quotes in agreement with some of the other versions, or none of them, or something is completely unique. Okay, but there is a tendency for some of those quotations to have Septuagint agreements. But the problem, if you want to call it that, is that this is where this turns into circular thinking, because the Hebrew version of Matthew has a tendency to agree with the Hebrew version of the Tanakh. And the Aramaic Peshitta New Testament has, when it quotes from the Tanakh, it has a tendency to agree with the Syriac Aramaic Peshitta version of the Tanakh. So, an argument that proves too much proves nothing at all. And so, if if the fact that the Greek New Testament has a tendency to agree with the Septuagint when it quotes from the Tanakh proves that the New Testament was originally written in Greek, then the fact that the Aramaic Peshitta version of the New Testament has a tendency to agree with the Aramaic Peshitta version of the Tanakh proves it was written in Aramaic, and the fact that the Hebrew Deuteronomy version of Matthew tends to agree with the Hebrew version of the Tanakh proves that it was written in Hebrew. And they can't all three be true. All three of these statements can't be true. Therefore, this is an argument that proves too much proves nothing at all. An argument that proves things that we know can't be true. They can't all be true. Proves nothing at all. Okay, so why would we have this situation? Well, there's two reasons. But before we get let's continue on. Let's look at some examples. Well, before we go into the examples, let me say I have a book in my library called, I think it's titled Rabbi J. And this book was originally written in German. And somebody made an English translation of this book to sell to the English reading audience. And I acquired a copy of the English translation of this book. So, one of the interesting things about the English translation of this book is that this book frequently translates uh, or quotes from the Bible, being a biblical, a book about a biblical text and about biblical uh, uh, characters and situations. Okay, so it frequently quotes the Bible. Now, I'm reading an English translation of a German book, and the German book was quoting the Bible. One might expect that I would be reading the English translator's freehand translation of those German quotations from the Bible, which were probably taken from, say, Luther's version or something in German, right? Um, but no, when I'm looking at my English translation of this German book, wherever it quotes the Bible, it quotes the King James Version. Now, why would it do this? Well, it does it because it's convenient and because it's the standard version in the English language, right? So, does that prove that this book was written in English since it's quoting from the King James Version? Of course not. I know it was written in German. I know it was translated into English. Okay. So then again, an argument that proves too much proves nothing at all, but it gives us an insight on why. One insight, there's another even stronger one that we're going to look at, but it gives us an insight on why some of the quotations in the Greek New Testament might have some agreements strong agreements with the standard Greek Tanakh, the Septuagint, because as the Greek translator was preparing his translation, when he came to quotations from the Tanakh, he either intentionally might have taken a version of the Septuagint or a copy of the Septuagint that he had and extracted his quotations rather than from the standard Greek version of those books, rather than do a freehand translation of them into Greek, or simply because he was very familiar with the Greek text of the Septuagint, he had a tendency in his mind to recall those verses as they appeared in the Septuagint, and that strongly influenced his Greek translation. Now, I was accused recently when I made some of these claims that they were anecdotal. So let's document, and we're not, this is very quickly, we're just going to look at three verses. One could make a detailed study that would be quite interesting, I think, of many, many, many verses. There are many verses that I started to look at and I said, well, this is a great agreement with the Masoretic text in the Hebrew or the Aramaic text, and it differs from the Greek, but the Greek wasn't really even quoting the Septuagint, so I didn't use those. And there are far more also examples than the ones I'm using. And some of the ones I almost used, they didn't exactly agree with the Septuagint in the Greek New Testament, so I didn't use them for that reason, even though there were some parallels. Um, so let's look at Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, which is quoting, and this is, by the way, our next page of our handout, Deutele Hebrew Matthew versus the Septuagint. Matthew chapter 4, verse 4 is quoting Deuteronomy 8:3. And Greek Matthews follows the Septuagint. It says, but he answered and said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God, or theos in the Greek. The Deutele Hebrew version of Matthew says, and Yeshua answered and said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh shall man live. Well, now that's very interesting because that is the reading of the Hebrew text of Deuteronomy 8:3, not the Septuagint. So here we have a prime example of Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, where the Greek Matthew is quoting the Septuagint, but the Deutele Hebrew Matthew is quoting the Hebrew. So if the Greek Matthew's quotation of Matthew 4:4, quoting the Septuagint version of Deuteronomy 8:3, proves Matthew was originally written in Greek, then just as easily or just as much one could say that the Deutele Hebrew Matthew quoting the Hebrew text of Deuteronomy 8:3 against the Septuagint proves it was written in Hebrew. Okay, obviously they can't both be true, so the argument that Matthew 4:4 is quoting the Septuagint is not a valid argument to prove that Matthew is written in Greek. All right, let's look at another passage on our next handout. We're going to go to the Aramaic Peshitta, and we're going to look at 1 Kepha chapter 1, verses 24 through 25, which is quoting Isaiah chapter 40, verses 6 and 8, but skipping verse 7. So the Greek version of 1 Kepha says, in chapter 1, verses 24 through 25, for all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of grass. The grass withers, and the flower thereof falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever, and this is the word which by the gospel is preached unto you. The Aramaic version of 1 Kepha, the Peshitta, says, because of this all flesh is grass, and all its beauty like a flower of the field, The grass dries up and the flower withers, and the word of our God abides forever. So the phrase and all the glory of man as the flower of grass in the Greek version of First Kepha is actually quoting the Septuagint. However, the Hebrew version of Isaiah chapter 40 and the Aramaic version of Isaiah chapter 40 both have and all its beauty like a flower of the field, which is what we read in the Aramaic version of First Kepha uh, here. So the Aramaic version of First Kepha is following the Peshitta, as well as, by the way, the Masoretic text, against the Septuagint. Now, there is an interesting agreement with the Septuagint here, and that is that verse 7 is omitted. Isaiah 40, verse 7 is omitted in both texts. But we also have a very interesting place where the Greek text is agreeing with the Septuagint, and the Aramaic text is agreeing with the Aramaic Peshitta and the Hebrew of the Masoretic text. All right, let's look at this next passage, Acts chapter 8, verses 32 through 33, which is quoting Isaiah 53, verses 7 through 8. And the Greek version of Acts says, the place of the scripture which we read was this, which he read was this. He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb before its shearers, so opened he not his mouth. In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. But the Aramaic text says, and the section of scripture on which he was reading was this: as a lamb he was led to the slaughter, as a sheep before the shearers is silent, even thus he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation he was led from prison and from judgment. And his generation, who will declare it? Because his life has been taken from the earth. Okay, so if you look at this in the handout, you can see this very easily that the Greek says as a sheep first and then like a lamb in the following line. But they're reversed in the Aramaic text of Acts, as a lamb appears first and then as a sheep follows. What do you know? The Greek is following the Septuagint because the Septuagint has as a sheep to the slaughter and as a lamb dumb. But the Peshitta Aramaic text, as well as the Masoretic text of the Hebrew, by the way, has as a lamb he was led to the slaughter, and as a sheep before the shearer is silent. So the Greek Septuagint flips them, and so does Greek Acts, but the Aramaic text of Acts has them in the correct order, following both the Peshitta version of Isaiah and the um, Masoretic text version of Isaiah. Then in Acts 8:33, you'll notice that the Aramaic has the phrase, "In his humiliation he was led from prison and from judgment." And that phrase, "he was led from prison," is absent from Greek Acts, and it's also absent from the Septuagint. Okay, but it is present in the Aramaic text of Isaiah as chapter 8, 53, verse 8, sorry, and it is present in the Masoretic text of Isaiah 53, 8. So here we have another instance where the Aramaic text of Acts is agreeing with the Aramaic text of Isaiah 53, as well as the Masoretic text of Isaiah 53 in Hebrew, against the not only against Greek Acts, but against the Septuagint as well. Now, there are some elements here that are from the Septuagint, appear in the Septuagint. I won't say they're from the Septuagint, but they agree with the Septuagint. The phrase "in his humiliation" appears in both the Greek and Aramaic version of Acts chapter 8, verse 33, and that is from the that I won't say from that is parallel to and agrees with the Isaiah 53:8 in the Septuagint. And because his life has been taken from the earth likewise. Okay, so here we sort of a half breed situation. Um, so why do we have and why would we have some agreements with the Septuagint text, even in the Aramaic version? Well, of the so-called New Testament, and the reason is this: um, when we were discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, Frank Cross, who was I believe the head of the original team, in 1953 he made an amazing discovery. Our next handout, in fact, quotes is a quote from a book I've got, Mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls Revealed by John Allegro, 1956, page 66. And actually, I'm quoting from the a 1980 reprint, I think it is. Um, 1981. It's the 1981 edition uh, that is falling apart, as you can tell. um, I purchased it back in 1981, so it's thoroughly used and falling apart. So I was 15 years old when I bought that book, and I still have it here. I'm 57 now, so had it for over 40 years. Um, so yeah, like I said, it's falling apart. But let me quote the book because it puts this frames this rather nicely. It says, whilst engaging one day in cleaning and assembling some fragile leather pieces of the Book of Samuel from the fourth cave. It says the Book of Samuel because in ancient times there was not First and Second Samuel; it was just one Book of Samuel. So uh, while he was assembling some fragile leather pieces of the Book of Samuel from the fourth cave, Frank Cross noticed that at one place the text seemed to run completely contrary to the Masoretic text. He checked again, and there was no doubt. He carried on, brushing very gently until the next line came into view. Again, the text showed marked variations, and the next few lines included a whole paragraph which was not represented in the standard Hebrew. His excitement mounting, Cross began to refer to the principal versions and almost immediately saw his text corresponded word for word with the Greek translation. The precious pieces joined to others, and time again he found positive correspondences with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text, until at the end of a week or so he was able to affirm that before him he had the answer to the text critic's dream, a Hebrew text from the same family of tradition as that used by the ancient translators of the Septuagint. So, what does this mean? It means that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls uh, that while some copies of Tanakh books in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like the Isaiah Scrolls, agree very, very closely with the Masoretic text, some of the other manuscripts, like this manuscript of Samuel, agree with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text, even though they're in Hebrew. Um, Now, before this find, the common wisdom was that if you found variations between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, it was just because the Septuagint translators were lousy translators. But now, when we find these variations, we understand that it's not because the Greek Septuagint was making up stuff or changing things. It was because the translators of the Greek Septuagint had a Hebrew text in front of them that differed from the Masoretic text. And finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are Second Temple era manuscripts of Tanakh books, and we find that sometimes they agree with the Septuagint, sometimes they agree with the Masoretic text, sometimes they agree with the Septuagint, and sometimes it's some of both. So, what this tells us is that in the so called New Testament, where we have a Second Temple era document that is quoting Tanakh books, we should expect that sometimes those quotations will agree with the Masoretic text, sometimes they'll agree with the Septuagint, and sometimes there will be a mixture of both. And that is exactly what we do find in the so called New Testament. All right, so there's what do we learn? We learn that Jerome tells us, or told us, and when he was writing in the 4th century, he told us that he saw the original Hebrew Matthew. And the original Hebrew Matthew that he saw tended to agree with the Masoretic text, not the Septuagint. We know that when we look at the Deuteronomic Hebrew version of Matthew, there's a strong tendency for it to agree with the Masoretic text against the Septuagint. And we look at the Peshitta, there's a Aramaic version as well as the Old Syriac Aramaic version, by the way. When we look at the Peshitta Aramaic version, we see a strong tendency for it to agree with the Peshitta Aramaic version of the Tanakh, and oftentimes with the Masoretic text as well. And sometimes there's a hodgepodge mixture. And then we find, on top of that, that we found copies of these Tanakh books in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We find copies of Tanakh books in the Dead Sea Scrolls that frequently agree with the Septuagint against, even though they're Hebrew, again, they agree with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. We would expect the New Testament then to have passages quoted from the Tanakh that would agree with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. We would expect that. In fact, if it always agreed with the Masoretic text against the Septuagint, and it's a Second Temple, it's supposed to be a Second Temple era document, that would actually be very suspicious, because that would be surprising. We shouldn't expect it to be quoting a text that frankly didn't exist yet. The standardization known as the Masoretic text comes from the Middle Ages. But we could even just say this, the Hebrew, what we really should be talking about is the Proto-Masoretic text, the Hebrew text of a type that agrees with the Masoretic text versus a Hebrew text of a type that agreed with the Septuagint. And so these quotations in the so called New Testament that seem to quote the Septuagint may, in fact, um, uh, just as easily be quoting from Hebrew manuscripts that existed at the time that agreed with the Septuagint. In fact, we should expect that because we find exactly that sort of thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the books of the Tanakh. And we should also recognize that if the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic, that we would expect the Greek translator to be influenced by the Septuagint, if not outright quote the Septuagint and insert Septuagint quotations whenever he's quoting from the Tanakh. All right, everybody. One more time, I need to ask people to please donate if you possibly can. We must raise $850 by the end of the day tomorrow, or we're going to have bills start bouncing and returned items, and that starts a cascade that's costly with fees and hard to recover from. We don't want that to happen. So we need your help today. You can donate by clicking on the donate link in the video description, or you can send donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Also, please subscribe to this video and help us build up our subscribership. Click on the notification bell so you get notifications when new videos come out. Let us know what you think of our videos in the comments. Participate in the discussions in the comments. Share these videos with your friends on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, etc., any kind of social media that you're interacting on. All right. Have a blessed day, everybody. Shalom.